everyone. My name is Kathy Aros, and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson. Thank you so much for joining us. Today's program is of significant importance and extremely timely, as Monday, March 22nd, happens to be World Water Day. Water in Arizona. From the earliest Native American settlements to the present, our natural arid climate and water shortage issues have always been critical factors in determining where and how people can live. Add to that today's increasing population and climate change. So much of Arizona's economy relies on a secure, long-term water supply. I recently read an interesting statistic that in Arizona, up to 70% of water is used outside the home. So, will we have enough, or are we going to run out? Our distinguished panelists today will be discussing different aspects of this very issue. The impact of a changing climate on our demand and supply. How to both sustain our water supplies, but still keep it affordable. And lastly, what is happening at the legislature regarding the future of Arizona's water? And now I want to turn the program over to our moderator, Lynn Lovelace, who will introduce our panelists. Lynn is co-chair of our League's Environmental Issues Committee and an ecologist. She previously taught ecology, plant biology, and conservation biology at the College of Wooster in Ohio. She also happens to be the president of the Tucson chapter of the Arizona Native Plant Society. Lynn, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kathy. We really appreciate your introduction. And welcome to all of you to our program entitled, What's Our Water Future? As Kathy said, we're delighted to have with us this morning three very knowledgeable speakers from different parts of the water world who are going to share with us their perspectives on water issues in Arizona now and into the future. We hope their presentations will give you insights not only into our successes in ensuring a clean and dependable water supply, but also some of the challenges that are facing us on the horizon. Arizona is an arid state, and water has always been precious, as Kathy said. Our natural landscapes and our wild habitats, from the Grand Canyon to the deserts of the borderlands, are shaped by the amount and timing of rainfall and snowmelt, stream flow, and flooding. But as our human population has grown and our lives have changed, the demands for water have grown commensurately. Almost every drop of water that falls on our watersheds today is already allocated to some end use for human needs. The factors affecting supply and demand, access and shortages, and stakeholder allocations continue to change over time, and so will our responses need to do as well. What then can we expect for our water future? I hope that after today's presentations, you'll have a better understanding of some of the challenges ahead. If you have questions during the presentations, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. In your questions, it would be helpful if you could indicate which of our three speakers you'd like to address your question, and we'll hear from all of our presenters first, and then take questions at the end of the program. Our first speaker, Catherine Jacobs, is the director of the Center for Climate Adaptation, Science and Solutions at the University of Arizona. This entity works with stakeholders to find science-based solutions to problems arising from climate change. Kathy is a professor in environmental science with appointments in geography and regional development and in hydrology and water resources. She has more than 20 years of experience in Ohio water policy, including 15 years as the director of the Tucson Active Management Area under the provisions of the Groundwater Management Act. From 2010 to 2015, Kathy was an advisor for the Obama White House in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and she served as the director of the 2014 National Climate Assessment. Kathy brings a broad perspective in her understanding of water and climate to our meeting today, and we look forward to hearing from you, Kathy.
Well, thank you very much, Lynn, and thanks so much to the League of Women Voters for giving me this opportunity to speak with you this morning. What I've been asked to talk about is climate change and the future of water in Arizona. And I want to talk about it in the context of not just what is climate change and what's going to happen with water, but what is it that we can do about this? Because obviously the impacts are going to have a lot to do with the degree to which we actually get prepared for what is almost definitely going to be happening to us. There. So first, I just wanted to give a little bit of climate change background. My guess is at this point, so many of you have seen a lot of these slides, but it is really important to note that we've been seeing warming since the early 1900s across the entire globe. And so you see this huge trajectory that is closely associated with the expansion of industrial activity in the entire globe. And on the right-hand side of my screen, you'll see that warming is not happening uniformly across the entire globe, but rather is distributed in rather predictable patterns. In other words, there's more warming over land than there is over water. And you can see that parts of the United States are not warming as fast, for example, the southeastern United States. But one of the most important things I see in this slide is that there is exactly one grid cell in the entire globe where the change in temperature is downward on average. And of course, this is over a period of time. This is not just in a single year, but it tells quite a story that we're seeing such consistent warming and that the distribution of impacts is actually not uniform. One of the things that's important for people to understand, because we hear so much about how natural variability is really what's causing all of this, is that when every component of natural variability is measured and monitored, it doesn't actually match what we're seeing. What we're seeing is global temperatures increasing, whereas the solar component is basically completely stochastic. The volcanic component has nothing to do with the pattern that we see here. And natural variability is continuing as it always has. The part that actually is different about this is the anthropogenic component, which is, our driving the system. And you can see there is a relationship between this line here and what we see going on in terms of the total global surface temperature. I like to try to simplify all of this in terms of what it is that we are likely to see in Southern Arizona. In terms of simplifying it for the Southwest more broadly, it's going to get hotter. There's just no doubt about that. We've already sort of locked ourselves into a trajectory where warming will increase at least for some time. That will reduce stream flows and already has. There's been a big impact on snowpacks, which of course are really important to us because snowpack is what feeds the Colorado River. Evapotranspiration, which is a combination of evaporation from the land and use of water by plants, is increasing in general because it's closely correlated with temperature. But it can't increase if the soils are so dry that the plants can't withdraw any more water. So there are places where it's gotten so dry that evapotranspiration isn't increasing. It is going to be drier on average, but that does not mean we won't have intense rainstorms in the future. So we need to be prepared for both increasing dryness and the potential for more intense rainstorms. And of course, there's a lot of cascading effects associated with these things. For example, heat waves can lead to brownouts and forest fires and reductions in air quality, and that can link to all kinds of system failures. So we can't think about these things as individual impacts, but rather how do they affect the systems that we depend on? Our Colorado River allocations are at risk. You've heard a lot about that, and I'll mention more about that in this presentation. But the things that I'm actually most concerned about are the implications for ecosystems, human health, and historically disadvantaged populations. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. My ecosystem concern really has to do with the fact that some of these climate impacts are irreversible. Extinction is permanent, biodiversity itself has value, and the quality of the environment has a lot to do with the quality of our life. And of course, that is part of what drives the Arizona economy, particularly when you think about things like tourism and the outdoor recreation, which are both really important parts of our quality of life and our economy. I've mentioned that the Colorado River is in a bit of trouble, and I'm sure this is not news because it has actually been reported very regularly over the last few years. But I think the most important part of this graphic is this upper left-hand corner where it shows Colorado River flows going down. The flows are going down, the temperatures are going up, but the precipitation is essentially even. In other words, this kind of variability, that this line is not, in fact, at a very major slant. And so the story here is that it's temperature that is the major culprit in bringing our water supplies, our Colorado River supplies down. And this is a point that wasn't well recognized until the last few years. And the reason this is important is we know for a fact that temperatures are going to continue to increase. We're a little unsure about exactly how the precipitation patterns will change, but temperature we actually do know will continue to go up. And I'd like to point out that when we're talking about Colorado River issues, we're not just talking about Arizona, we're talking about 40 million people who live in 7 basin states and Mexico and 29 tribal nations. We have a lot of negotiating to do if we have to solve problems along the Colorado River. And so it's not a simple matter to get these issues resolved. One point of trying to be more hopeful than I have just been is that we actually have a very sophisticated water management system in Arizona already. Since 1980, we have been actively managing the water supplies in the 5 active management areas, which are the colored blobs in the center here, and to a smaller degree, the 3 irrigation non-expansion areas. The problem is all of our water management system is really focused on these areas, and outside of the active management areas, the rural areas do not have the same degree of access to renewable supplies or regulatory tools. But the Groundwater Management Act did establish a water rights system. It supported the completion of the Central Arizona project. It's established mandatory conservation requirements for all users, all large water users in all of these areas. And it requires that we use renewable water supplies that are available for 100 years before we approve new subdivisions. So it's a massive step forward in water management, which is now the foundation of our ability to prepare for climate change. And as I'm sure many of you know, but perhaps have not seen this particular graphic, this shows that in the Tucson active management area, though there were massive declines in amount of water and storage historically, since the Central Arizona project has been in place, we've actually turned that around and groundwater levels are rising. I think the thing that's a little tricky about this is the assumptions going into the future depend on the normal delivery of Central Arizona project water. And of course, we all know at some level, they are not going to be normal deliveries. We don't know the degree to which there'll be cutbacks, but the slant of this line may not be as optimistic as what's shown here. I mentioned the fact that most of the effort of the Groundwater Management Act is focused in active management areas and irrigation non-expansion areas, but the reality is that 20% of the population is outside of the active management areas. And that's nearly 1.5 million people and growing rapidly. 31 out of the 46 water basins in our state rely on groundwater for more than 75% of the water use. And some communities are entirely reliant on groundwater supplies. We see agricultural production increasing outside AMAs, primarily because it's regulated inside AMAs. So there are these opportunities where it's unregulated to expand groundwater pumping. And of course, we are in a drought. which means that the stress is increasing over time. Another component of the challenges we're facing is the way our legal system works. And I suspect Kirsten is going to talk about this more, but because our legal system doesn't connect groundwater and surface water, even though they are physically connected, that actually increases our challenges in terms of trying to manage our water supplies in a sustainable way going forward, especially with climate change going on. There are other challenges, and these are things that we can fix. There's currently no state level tool available to protect habitats and species, or to protect shallow groundwater and surface flows that support our increasingly fragile riparian systems. How are we going to deal with both the long-term trends that we know are going to happen and the potential for extreme events and cascading impacts? It's being prepared that will limit the impacts. Managing risk is a really tricky thing because we know that climate change is not the only driver of change in the future, but we need to effectively integrate the risks associated with climate change as we're working on these other issues. But because climate change does influence literally every sector and literally every part of the globe, our understanding of how these impacts are evolving is still coming together, we will have surprises. And so the more robust our response systems are, the better. I just want to emphasize that we have accomplished an enormous amount in Arizona relative to water management. I'm not going to go through all of these things, but we have now close to 4 decades of progress since the Groundwater Management Act was passed. We've made huge progress in all of these areas and a lot to be proud of. So those who feel, perhaps a little hopeless about what's going on have to recognize how much we have accomplished and how much we still can. We are not victims here. We are people who can control some of these outcomes. And we've also done a lot locally and much to be proud of. We have multiple sources of water that we're using in an integrated way. We have massive amounts of aquifer recharge going on. Our conservation achievements are amazing and not even reported on recently, which is kind of interesting because I think many people think we don't even have conservation programs when in fact we're under mandatory conservation programs right now, but we're meeting them and so there's no headlines. Lots of progress with stormwater and green infrastructure, so we've done a lot. But I think it is important for us to know that the trajectory that we are on into the future matters incredibly in terms of how manageable all these impacts are going to be. If we stay on the upper line, the 8.5 scenario, which is the higher end scenario that most climate people think we might be following, that is such a different future than if we immediately start moving into a lower emissions scenario where the impacts will be so much lower and the costs will be reduced. So we're at a really major decision point. And fortunately, we're seeing the federal government moving strongly in that direction just in the last several months. But I did want to just briefly hit on the things to worry about relative to the Colorado River and the things not to worry about, because there are some actually pieces of good news. First, the Colorado River is over allocated and our allocation system is not flexible. So our supplies are variable, but the system is fixed. Temperature impacts are a huge driver of supply reductions and demand increases. The Central Arizona Project has the lowest priority on the Colorado River. Our Groundwater Replenishment District and Arizona Water Banking Authority, which are part of our really innovative management systems, have historically depended on excess water, which won't be there. Reduction in Central Arizona Project water means more groundwater pumping, and tribal and upper basin water allocations are not fully allocated, fully utilized yet. And so how are we going to accommodate these rightful desires to expand water use at the same time that our supplies are contracting? We need to include more voices in our solutions for Colorado River management. That will necessarily increase the complexity. It probably does mean we'll get better solutions, but they're going to be harder to arrive at. We have the potential for multi-decadal drought, meaning longer term droughts than we've been seeing recently. And of course, extreme climate events and potential damage increasing. I've mentioned that ecosystems are vulnerable and that people are unpredictable. So it's critically important that we start to get these ideas under control. But in terms of the reasons not to worry, municipal demand has the highest priority on the Central Arizona project. And so the likelihood of cutbacks to Tucson water and other allocations in Southern Arizona are not that high. Upper Basin and tribal demand is not built out, which is an opportunity as well as a problem. Shortage sharing criteria and drought contingency plans have reduced our risk. We have significant groundwater in storage that we've already put underground through aquifer recharge, and the basin states do have a long history of working together. But as I mentioned, a lot of our future depends on the degree to which we manage emissions, not just our ability to be prepared for impacts. So I want to just finalize my comments by saying how important facts are in solving these problems. If we're able to adequately connect science and decision making, I think we'll have a much better chance moving forward of getting to a place where we are well prepared for the risks that are coming and can really take advantage of the opportunities. So I will stop there and turn it back over to Lynn. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Kathy. That's really helpful. And I think it's very clearly stated here how important this point in time is in our future decision making and in the choices that we retain into the future. Our next speaker is going to focus a little more closely, I think, on the Tucson region and its water future. Andrew Greenhill has had a variety of positions within the city of Tucson, and he's currently the Intergovernmental Relations Manager for the city of Tucson and for the Tucson Water Facility. He previously worked as the mayor's chief of staff and as an assistant to the city manager of the city of Tucson. And so he has lots of experience in our local government in our local area. Andrew has also served as a middle school teacher with Teach for America, a board member with Code for America, and a former president of Greater Tucson Leadership. He's going to help us understand some of the workings of the Tucson water basin. Andrew?
First off, thanks to the League for inviting me today. And really look forward to giving this presentation. I think it follows both literally and thematically well from what Kathy presented just now. There's a lot of things that we've done in our region to help prepare ourselves for the situation we're in now. So it's important to recognize the good things that we've done, but also be very mindful and attentive to facts and trends as we move into the future when it comes to how we manage and think about our precious local water supplies. So with that, let me get started. Basically, Tucson has really two, but actually 4 water sources that we look at and try to manage in terms of making sure we have sufficient and affordable water supplies here. The first, and what's become the most important, of course, is the Colorado River, which is nowadays is meeting close to all of our municipal water demand here in the Tucson area. Next, there's groundwater, which was our historic primary use of or source of water for many years. And as Kathy mentioned, we've made a pretty good transition over the last number of years from those sensitive and precious and limited groundwater supplies to the more renewable Colorado River supplies. And today in my discussion, I'll mostly focus on the Colorado River and groundwater. But just to mention here, there is also reclaimed water. And this is more or less treated wastewater that's treated to a high level. And Tucson Water has a separate pipe system that collects this treated wastewater, and we use it for non-potable purposes. So irrigation of parks and fields all across the community. That over the years has lessened our demand for potable water, which again is good for water management. And then finally, I'll add rainwater and stormwater. So Kathy mentioned one water approaches to water management. And what that really means is focusing on every single drop. And the city of Tucson has introduced a number of measures, including a green stormwater fee on bills. And we use those dollars to help improve and expand our ability to capture and put to good use both rainwater and stormwater. Again, I won't focus too much on that today, but it's a growing and important area for us to focus on, again, to just get maximum value on every drop of water that comes into our community. So with that, just to be very clear and upfront about what do we do at the city level to make sure, and what actions do we take to make sure that we have a reliable water supply here in Tucson. So first, conservation. And again, Kathy mentioned this in her talk. It's an extremely important part of how we manage water in our region. We've seen some incredible accomplishments when it comes to reducing water demand in our region. And I'll show you a graph in a little bit that demonstrates that very clearly. Investment, running a municipal water system that serves 750,000 people, which is what Tucson Water does, is expensive. And to do that in a way that also makes sure we are well prepared for a drier, hotter future isn't cheap. So it requires ongoing investment over a long period of time. And that's important both to make sure we have our Colorado River water supply available to us, but also what do we need to do both to keep our delivery system intact, to maintain our pipes and pumps and everything we need to get water to the tap, but also remediation. We have some groundwater contamination issues in our region. And while we don't want to use the groundwater when we don't have to, we do have to make sure that when we do need it, that it's clean, clean and safe. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges we have in Tucson when it comes to remediating or treated contaminated groundwater in our region. There's collaboration. So water storage agreements, water sharing agreements. How do we work with our partners in our region, Oro Valley, Marana, other water delivery agencies, and even across the state, where even at this point, Tucson is storing water for Phoenix here in the Tucson area. These are all meant to again, be as efficient as possible and get maximum use of our limited water supplies. Storage is very important, and we've invested a lot. We need to continue to invest in storing our CAP or Colorado River water for the future. And again, as we've mentioned, that one water approach, how do we expand on some of our innovative programs to capture and use rainwater and stormwater, especially when it could mean less demand on Colorado River water. So with the sad passing of Mayor Walkup last weekend, it's actually a good time for us to recognize what I would call a very consistent water policy across the last few administrations here at the city of Tucson. The city of Tucson mayor and council manage Tucson Water. They approve rates. They direct the policies of the Tucson Water Department. And I'd say since what were called the water wars of the 1990s, over the last few administrations and continuing today with Mayor Romero, we've seen a very consistent water policy set of policies, and actually I'll be able to show you that in the next graph. A fun moment, the picture you see on the screen of Mayor Walkup is him giving the order over the radio there to turn on the pumps at the Avra Valley Storage and Recovery Plant back in 2001. And again, as you'll see on the next graph, through again his 12 years as mayor, Mayor Rothschild's 8 years and now into the second year of Mayor Romero, we've seen that a commitment to policies continue over time, and we're seeing real results from those consistent policies. And here it is. When I give talks about Tucson water, and I'd say the contemporary history, if that's not an oxymoron, of Tucson water and how we've used water in our region, at least since World War II, this is my favorite slide or my favorite graph. And there's two stories that get told in this graph, and I'll tell you them now. So first, as you can see, this graph demonstrates the total use of water in the Tucson water service area over the last, well, 80 years, 1940 to just short of 2020. And so what you can see in the shape of the graph, you can see that as the community has grown since 1940, the demand on Tucson water has grown with that growth. And so you could see through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, the demand on Tucson water to deliver water has grown over that time. Again, I think consistent with the growth in the community. But since the year 2000, you can see that that demand had plateaued around the year 2000 and started to come down. So why is that? And how did we get to the point where the amount of water we're delivering today is the same amount of water we delivered in 1985 with hundreds of thousands of more people in our service area? I think number one, that demonstrates the success of our community when it comes to conservation. So whether it's water efficient appliances or just through education of our community, people in Tucson know we live in a desert. And take active, real measures to use less water. And we've seen a real, something we ought to celebrate and recognize in our community. I'd say those trends continue to go down. Of course, we'll look at 2020, as more people stayed home during the pandemic, and we'll see how many people wash their hands for 20 seconds multiple times a day as we finalize our 2020 numbers. But I'd say long-term, you can see how the trend continues to show decreased water demand in Tucson. That's good. The second thing I want to point to on this graph is the source of water that is used to meet that demand. So the dark blue is groundwater. And so you can see that again from 1940 till right around 1990, the one key source of water that we used to meet that demand was groundwater. And so for decades, Tucson Water would put in more wells and pump more and more groundwater from underneath central Tucson in order to meet that demand. We knew all along that that was not a sustainable source of water. And sure enough, getting into the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we saw that the aquifer under Tucson, that level, the groundwater level was decreasing. And it took more and more energy to get that water out from further and further underground. That was not a sustainable use of water. So with the introduction of the Colorado River, the CAP project and the Colorado River water to Tucson, we've been able over time to transition from depending mostly on groundwater to the light blue on the graph, which is Colorado River water, that renewable river water supply. For those of you who know Tucson history and remember, you can see that spike of that CAP water use in the 1990s. That was when we started to deliver that CAP water. There were problems with the delivery and the community said, shut that off and don't use that water until you can get it right. And that's where we get to the year 2000 with, again, the election of Mayor Walkup and the introduction of the CAP water to Tucson. Tucson Water fixed those problems and slowly over time has introduced more and more Colorado River water to meet demand and turned off, or at least turned on standby, those groundwater wells in central Tucson. And so now you can see the success that we've seen over the last 20 years to basically transition most, if not all of our demand to more renewable water supplies, to the river water mostly. Now at the bottom of the graph, you can see the purple color, that's reclaimed water, as I mentioned before. That meets quite a bit of our non-potable demand. And then a little bit of the aqua color, and that is remediated groundwater. That means water that was contaminated with chemicals that we've treated to a high level and taken out those harmful chemicals and now helps meet our demand as well. And again, I'll talk a little bit about some of our groundwater challenges going forward. So how does the Colorado River system work in the Tucson region? This is a kind of schematic map of our region. At the top of the map, you can see the blue line that extends, looks like from I-10, but to the west into the Avra Valley area. That is the CAP Canal. It brings water to our two main recharge basins in Avra Valley. There's the Central Avra Valley Storage and Recharge Project here. And then to the south, the Southern Avra Valley. So you have Central and Southern. They're known affectionately by their awkward acronyms, CAVSAR and SAVSAR. The CAP water gets put into recharge basins in these areas. The water is then recharged. It goes into these basins, it percolates down till it meets with the groundwater table in those areas. And then the water is pumped up and delivered, as you can see through these arrows, into the central Tucson area. Some CAP water, Colorado River water, gets delivered down here to what's called the Upper Santa Cruz. And that water there too is also recharged and delivered into our service area here. And then the last thing I'll mention on this map is you can see some of these faded arrows here. These reflect what are called wheeling agreements. This is where Tucson receives Colorado River water that belongs, or at least is allocated to some of our partners in our region. This one to the north, mostly to Oro Valley. This one to the southeastern part of our region, which is the Vail Water Company. And so what we do is we collect their CAP water, we move it or wheel it through our facilities, including our water system in Tucson, to those entities, and that enables them to use that Colorado River water instead of pumping more and more groundwater. In some cases, these entities have rights to the Colorado River water. They just don't have the distribution system, the transmission pipes, the distribution pipes to get the water physically from the canal to their service areas. And so that's something else that we do with our partners here, again, to decrease as much as possible the demand on groundwater across the region. So if you got up in space and took an MRI of the region and wanted to see where are the effects of some of these efforts on the groundwater table underneath Tucson, you can see that in this map of the region. The hotter colors generally are where we've seen the most groundwater decline. And then the lighter or cooler colors, I'd say, the greens, the blues, even the purples, are where we've seen the most increase in the water table over the last number of years. So you wouldn't be surprised here to see that in the Avra Valley area where we are storing our Colorado River water supplies, the water table there has been rising quite a bit. And so you can see there where in these purple and blue areas, the water table is going up. Looking into what we call central Tucson, you can see where in the Oro Valley area in the northwest, in some of the areas in the southeast, the water table has gone down. In that central area, the water table is naturally replenishing. As far as the Colorado River is concerned, as Kathy mentioned, we are seeing declines in the water levels in both Lake Powell and Lake Mead, and those are the ways in which we measure shortage or will declare shortage on the Colorado River, and that will have impacts across the basin. Here you can see some of the projections of where that water levels will be, both in this chart, it's Lake Mead, and we are entering a year where we're watching those levels closely. And I'd say the highest probability as we speak is that we will go into what's called a Tier 1 shortage on the Colorado River in calendar year 2022, next year. In Arizona, again, as Kathy mentioned, we have a priority system where it comes to water. Think of this graph as a container of water, where the allocations at the bottom are the higher priority water system, water allocations. So Indian and what's called municipal and industrial waters are at the bottom here are the higher priorities. And as you move to the top, non-Indian agriculture, agriculture, and then excess water are the bodies of water that in a shortage will get cut first. So if there is a tier 1 shortage next year, that would mean that of the more or less 1.6 million acre feet of Colorado River water that goes into the CAP Canal, about 512,000 acre feet would be cut, and that water would be left in Lake Mead in the river. About 192,000 is what we contribute right now, but we would add about 320,000 acre foot that we'd leave in the river upon the declaration of a tier 1 shortage next year. As you can see, most of what would be cut is in that agriculture excess water and some of that non-Indian ag water. There'd be little effect on municipal and industrial water, which is again where Tucson Water's allocation comes from. So net, I would say that if there is a tier 1 shortage next year, there'd be some small moves of water around, but net, there would be no cut to Tucson Water's supplies. But where I think our water customers would see an effect is that the rate of Colorado River water would increase. So that's where we'll see the impacts. Even if we don't lose any water, the rates that we pay for that Colorado River water will go up quite a bit. And so that's something for all of us to be mindful of. Real quickly, this is our Tucson Water checkbook. So you can see we check every year, how much water did we get? How much of that water was put to meeting demand versus how much water do we get to keep, so to speak, in savings that we can save for years where we might actually get cuts to our allocation. And so the top of the chart is exactly how much water we get every year based on our allocation. About 144,000 acre feet of water comes to Tucson every year. The blue line is what we use to meet demand. And then the kind of hatched blue to the top is what we have in savings. And so you can see again, over time, the demand is going down. So the amount we can keep in savings goes up. We added 65,000 acre feet of storage or of savings in 2019. And again, those trends seem to be going in the right direction. And here you could see kind of the balance of our savings account. And as of the 2019 year, we have over 460,000 acre feet, or what we call long-term storage credits, in storage. So again, there we feel like we're on the right track. Real quick then, again, because that's the biggest part of our water supply. I've talked about our Colorado River water, and next I'll move to groundwater. Again, we don't really use groundwater to meet our demand anymore, as you saw in that historic chart, but groundwater, maintaining it and maintaining the quality of it is really important, not just for environmental purposes, but it really is our backup supply should anything happen to the Colorado River Canal. There's also times during the year where the canal is down for maintenance. And so there is always the need to make sure that those groundwater supplies are available. And so real quick, I want to talk about two threats to our groundwater in the area of groundwater quality. First is TCE and 1,4-dioxane. This contamination stems from industrial and military activities in our region going back to the 50s and 60s. Those chemicals were used in solvents that were used in those operations. In those decades in the past, they leached into the groundwater and moved in underground, extending the plume of contaminated groundwater to the north and northwest, which is where how groundwater moves in our region. For decades, we've been treating this water. Nobody is drinking this water, but it's a decades-long effort to treat those waters and to remove that contamination. We continue to do that, and that work will continue into the decades to come. And then finally, unfortunately, we have a new threat to our groundwater quality here in our region. It's a set of chemicals called PFAS, PFAS. Think of PFAS as kind of a family of chemicals. It's the stuff that's often used in non-stick materials. So your Teflon pans, your Chinese food containers usually contain those types of chemicals. In our region, the way most of those chemicals got into the groundwater is the use of firefighting foam both at the airport and probably from military operations at our Air Force Base. We're seeing some of that in our groundwater table. We're working with the federal government and others to identify where we're seeing that contamination and to start designing and working on treatment systems that will take that PFAS out of the water as well. And just to put my last slide here, just to put a sense of the scale of that, we are monitoring where we're seeing those chemicals. And while this chart may be a little bit hard to see, but we go into those wells, we check to see how much of that PFAS contamination we're seeing. And while the EPA health limit is 70 parts per trillion of that chemical in water supplies, we are seeing levels in the hundreds, the thousands, and even higher than 10,000 parts per trillion in some of these areas. So we have some good partners with the Air Force, the state ADQ, and others working closely with our federal delegation on this issue. And ultimately, we'll all need to partner on stemming and ultimately treating those groundwater contamination issues in our region. So with that, I just want to summarize by saying we're well positioned for shortage, we believe, by all the things we're doing, but for all the reasons Kathy mentioned, and as we know, we must maintain and increase our efforts in our region to deal with current and future threats to our climate that will in turn affect our water supply. And we have to redouble our efforts in those areas that we've been working on, again, consistently over the last 20 plus years: conservation, investment, collaboration, storage, and our One Water efforts. So with that, I thank you for the opportunity to present, and I look forward to questions after the presentations.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was a champion effort at summarizing a really complicated system in a really short time. And there are additional resources out there. We've prepared a handout that we are going to probably end up posting on the League webpage for further resources, so you can update yourselves on some of the details that he didn't get to. Our last speaker is Senator Kirsten Engel. Kirsten was elected to represent District 10 in the Arizona Senate in the year 2020 after already serving 2 terms previously as the representative from that same district in East Tucson. In her years in the legislature, both in the House and in the Senate, she's been a member of the Natural Resources, Energy, and Water Committee and an active participant in discussions about water and natural resources across the state. Kirsten is an environmental attorney, and she's worked in the past for the Environmental Protection Agency, the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, and the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office. But since 2005, she's been in Tucson. She's been on the faculty of the James E. Rogers College of Law at the University of Arizona, and there she teaches environmental, administrative, and public policy law. Kirsten is going to give us some perspective on legislative efforts to address our future water issues. Thank you, Kirsten.
Thank you so much. It's quite an honor to be part of this group and to be after Kathy Jacobs and Andrew Greenhill, 2 people I really rely on to understand these issues. So I'm going to cover some of the same territory, but where I can, try to fill in a little bit what's happening with Arizona state policy. So it's water is obviously an incredibly important issue to Arizona, a desert state. And as you might imagine, it's frequently the topic of legislative action and something where we have to remain vigilant in keeping it in front of the voters, get the voters' feedback on this issue, and fulfill our role in terms of stewarding these important resources for future generations. So I am going to, divide my talk into talking about hot topics, and they will somewhat track what we've already heard, talk a little bit about the Colorado River, other Arizona surface waters, and then groundwater. So, okay, whoops, okay. Just to remind everybody, where is Arizona getting its water from? What is the general breakdown in terms of where we get our water? So Colorado River, front and center, 36% approximately of all of Arizona's waters, but even more groundwater, 42%. in-state rivers, about 18%, and reclaimed water. And of course, we're hoping to increase that percentage from reclaimed water so that we can reuse our water and not draw upon maybe dwindling supplies in some of these other areas. To give you just a bit of background of who is using our water, how is it broken down within our economy? The biggest sector in terms of water use is agriculture. Arizona remains a very strong agricultural state, and that is where most of our water is going. Municipal use, though, still a big user of water, around 21%, according to, these are all statistics from ADWR, and industrial use about 5%. Okay, I know that's very general, but just some, very basic understanding of where our water comes from and who is using our water. So let's talk about Colorado River water. As we know, 36% of our water comes from the Colorado River. And we've heard from Kathy Jacobs about the threats to the Colorado River. Certainly, it's been, as you can see here from this iconic picture of Lake Mead, you can see the water levels have dropped over the years and is exposing the sides of that large reservoir that we have. It's important to know that, yes, Colorado River is being racked very much by drought, and that is connected to climate change. But from the get-go, the Colorado River was over-allocated among the various states and other users of that this important Western water body. So in 1922, the Western states, came up with entered into a compact to allocate the Colorado River, and at that time, the flow was overestimated in the Colorado River. So it's important to know that from the very beginning, this huge, wonderful body of water has been overallocated, and we're also dealing with more current shortages and projected shortages in water as a result of things like climate change. So how is the water allocated? Well, I won't go into the real specifics, but there's both the upper basin states that consist of Utah, New Mexico, Wyoming, and Colorado. There's also the lower basin states, of which we are a part, Arizona, Nevada, and California. Mexico, of course, has an important claim and allocation on the Colorado River because it goes down into Mexico. And of course, our federally recognized Indian tribes also have claims upon the Colorado River. I think there's 29 federally recognized tribes who have a right to Colorado River allocation. So a lot of folks that need this water and have legal claims to it, but again, an over-allocated resource. So just in terms of some of the recent policy developments that have happened with respect to this, you heard from Andrew about the potential for a shortage, and we are currently operating on something under a legal document, basically an agreement among the lower basin states known as the 2007 guidelines. And what they do basically is say who among the lower basin states what kind of cuts will they experience if the levels of water in Lake Mead go down. And here you can see it's divided into tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 shortage. We're currently in what's known as the tier 0 shortage, which has not been a problem for us to address. But as Andrew mentioned, the current prediction is that we could go into a tier 1 shortage in 2022, which results in a cut to Arizona's allocation of Colorado River water. Arizona happens to be the most junior state in terms of its allocation of Colorado River water. So about 2 years ago, Arizona started to put together a planning group. Here's a picture of one of those planning group meetings with different stakeholders as well as lawmakers across the state of Arizona to talk about what would happen if we went into these different shortage tiers, and if we could come up with agreements within Arizona in order to, in essence, better allocate that shortage or more equitably allocate it if possible to avoid certain ill effects. And also, what could we do to keep more water in Lake Mead? Could we incentivize the keeping of more water there so it would make it less likely that we would go into one of these shortage tiers, or certainly the more severe shortage tiers? That resulted actually successfully in something called the Drought Contingency Plan, which was a piece of legislation that was passed by the Arizona legislature on the very last deadline, the day of the deadline that they had to act, which was January 31st, 2020, before the federal government came in and did some of this planning for us. So people were very happy that we were able to work out some kind of an agreement. And this was later incorporated into federal law and is what we're operating under today. So in essence, what the DCP did is it didn't change too many things. It really made it easier within Arizona. We basically redistributed some of the cuts that we may see as early as next year, especially with respect to agriculture, which otherwise would feel the full brunt of some of these, the tier 1 shortage, using the water they get through the Central Arizona Project. And we also incentivize keeping more water in Lake Mead. Many other things came out of that drought contingency plan that I don't have time to talk about. But what I wanted to leave you with is that this was it was celebrated. It was an important step for Arizona to make, but by no means does it really address the real problems that we will be facing in the future as we have less water on the Colorado water system. So what we're looking at in the future is revisiting those 2007 guidelines. That's actually a process that needs to be done by 2025. And we're looking at how can we restructure some of those rules for how Colorado River water is used by the Western states. So with that, I'd actually like to talk about Arizona's other surface waters, of which actually Arizona has many. This is a picture of the beautiful San Pedro River, which is one of our most beautiful internal Arizona riparian areas. Unfortunately, though, Arizona surface waters are in trouble. Surface waters protect, they provide us with drinking water. They're just so important. Wildlife habitat, flood control, groundwater recharge. They're also an important location for recreation, boating, swimming, fishing, you name it. Arizona has a $20 billion a year tourist economy. Much of that is tied to Arizona's surface waters. But unfortunately, those surface waters really are facing a lot of threats. They've been altered or lost as a result of dams, surface water diversions for things like agriculture and other uses, and groundwater pumping that occurs close to those surface waters can actually be pumping not groundwater, but actually pumping water out of that riparian area. It's also important to know that much of Arizona's sort of water is not waters that have constant flow. Over 90% of our wet areas are known as ephemeral washes. This would be something where the water is only flowing in response to rainfall. And this is to be distinguished from our river systems and from our perennial or even our intermittent flowing waters. But these ephemeral washes are extremely important because they capture that monsoon water, monsoon rainfall, and they recharge our aquifers. And of course, they are a source of water for wildlife, etc. On the right here of this slide, you can see on the sort of map of Arizona with a lot of blue in it. That's showing really all of Arizona's waters, including these ephemeral washes, which is over 90% of Arizona's wet areas. On the right, you can see basically the waters that are Arizona's river systems. Okay, so what can we do about these threats to our surface waters? Well, we can identify and quantify the surface water rights so that they can be protected by the private water rights claimants. This is actually a legal process in Arizona. It's known as the general stream adjudication. It's basically an enormous legal process where we have a special master working under a judge that is actually identifying and quantifying the different claims to surface water. That process is very slow, but its importance is that once that is solidified and quantified, we can make sure that some of that surface water is not being lost to unauthorized, basically, groundwater pumping. Other things we can do is we can protect federally reserved surface water rights that support federally protected riparian areas, such as the San Pedro National Conservation Area. There are federally recognized water rights that support these natural areas, and it's very important that those water rights are recognized even under state law. We need to do more to protect Arizona's watersheds, starting with identifying the threats to those watersheds and then putting in place plans to protect our watersheds. And finally, we need to work to protect Arizona's ephemeral washes that are such an important part of this overall system. Arizona is currently going through a process of looking at additional waters that would be protected under legislation known as basically waters of the state legislation. These would be waters that Arizona would protect that would not be necessarily subject to federal jurisdiction and federal protections under the Clean Water Act. So the last topic I'd like to address is groundwater, and you've already heard much about that in Andrew Greenhill's presentation. Groundwater is so important to Arizona. As I said, supplying over 40% of the water that we use. I know that some of this has also been mentioned, but just some quick facts about sort of the legal structure with respect to groundwater. Arizona has a Groundwater Management Act that was passed in 1980. And in 1980, clearly Arizona was way ahead of its time in protecting our groundwater. Kathy Jacobs was working on in this area at that time and was one of our leaders on this topic, working to protect Tucson's groundwater under the Groundwater Management Act and managing that the Tucson active management area. What's important to know with respect to the Groundwater Management Act is that its real focus are those active management areas. There are 5 of those across the state, and they tend to be focused on areas of population. That makes sense. That's where there's been so much historic groundwater use. And for most of these areas, they are subject to a goal of achieving safe yield. No more water taken out than you put in by 2025. Some of them are on track to meet this goal, but not all of them. The Groundwater Management Act does not regulate rural groundwater withdrawals where groundwater pumping for agriculture and development is resulting in dropping water tables in those areas. So what can we do about some of these issues with respect to groundwater? Well, first of all, we have to protect the groundwater resources that we have. Andrew talked about some of the threats from chemical contamination that that have been discovered, are being monitored, and are being addressed at this time. But we need to remain vigilant and ensure that we continue to both monitor for that as well as fund those cleanup actions, because of course this is our precious groundwater, and that's something where there's both federal help and responsibility in that area, as well as state help and responsibility. Where it applies, the AMAs, we need to make sure that they reach their safe yield goal and that they maintain it, that we have the regulatory structure in place to make sure that once we reach this safe yield goal, we don't fall out of it. I think with respect to the areas that really are not subject to very much under our Groundwater Management Act, we need to address those issues as well to protect the rural areas of our state. The first step is to meter the groundwater withdrawals outside the AMAs so that we have better information about groundwater use. It's currently not required under law. Another thing that we can do is designate, where appropriate, new irrigation non-expansion areas to limit the expansion of irrigated agriculture in areas where groundwater will not be available to support more farming into the future. And finally, we should be looking at how we might regulate groundwater use outside our active management areas. Finally, in conclusion, I think I've been giving you conclusions along the way, but just one big conclusion that Arizona certainly has very many water challenges, but there are solutions. There are a great deal of solutions, and they're being discussed among stakeholders. I have to say, I think much more could be done in the policy arena to act on these, to debate and act on some of these solutions around which there is substantial agreement. So we just need to get to work on these. So with that, I look forward to answering any questions I can.
Great, thank you so much, Kirsten. And so this has been a very information-full 40 minutes or hour, I guess we've been doing this. We have lots of questions, so let me see if we can get to them right away, but we appreciate all your inputs. The first question, there were two questions that I guess I will direct perhaps to Kathy or perhaps to Andrew. One of them is phrased as follows: we appear to have huge numbers of new housing in Tucson. Are we really approving building permits in line with the 100 supply plan? And there was another question about whether we're really enforcing that 100-year assured water supply component. So Kathy, would you like to take that?
Sure, I'll jump in. Since the Assured Water Supply Program is near and dear to my heart, I actually led the development of the rules. I don't have any very recent knowledge of exactly how things are going, but I'm pretty sure that the Assured Water Supply rules are in fact being enforced. It's not all that intuitive for a normal person to understand how it is working. But the main way it's happening is either people are receiving direct delivery of Central Arizona Project water through Tucson Water or other providers that have access, or they're having their groundwater use offset by recharging water underground, perhaps through the groundwater replenishment district. This is a complicated mechanism. Basically, there's a report back from each household how much water was used, and then that amount of water gets put back in the aquifer by the replenishment district. So yes, it is being enforced. And I saw there was a question about how recharge happens. I'll just explain that for a second. We actually have facilities in the Tucson Basin, particularly in Avra Valley, mostly Tucson water facilities, but not only, that are spreading basins where water is put on the surface and then it percolates down into the aquifer. It happens extremely efficiently, much more so than we anticipated when we first designed these programs. But there are other ways of doing recharge, and they include exchanges with farmers. So a municipality can give their CAP water to a farmer, and then the farmer doesn't use their own groundwater rights, and then the municipality gets the right to pump that water in the future. So there are lots of exchanges, I guess is how I would describe it, going on that are not visible to the naked eye, but the evidence that it's working is in both the chart that Andrew showed and the one that I did. The water levels are rising. So yes, we're building more houses, but people on average are using less water per person, and we are actually recharging the groundwater at a rate faster than we're withdrawing it. So it's all good at the moment.
Great, thank you. And just to expand on that slightly, because I was going to ask Andrew about that as well. There was a question about what are water storage facilities composed of? Are they underground chambers, natural or artificial, or above ground tanks? What is actually out there? If you haven't seen it, it's hard to understand. Andrew, would you take that one?
Sure. And I'm happy to say there have been times in the past where both for Senator Engel and many other policymakers in our region, I've gotten to lead some tours to take folks out to Avra Valley to see our recharge basins themselves. I didn't stop in my presentation to point them out, but I think at least a couple of slides, I had photos of those recharge basins out in Avra Valley. Think of them as, multi-acre kind of basins, basically like just carving out, a little bit of the ground. And we take the raw CAP water, the Colorado River water, through pipelines that come off the canal. They go in, the water is directed into those basins, and the water then percolates through the soils. And in fact, we've seen that percolation contributes to some of the treatment or even cleaning of that water as it percolates through those soils. Ultimately, it goes maybe a couple of 100 feet through those soils and then into the groundwater table. So it mixes with the native groundwater in that Avra Valley area. That mixture then is, it's there. And when we need water, we pump that water back up. We treat it just really with just a little bit of chlorine. Again, the percolation actually does a good job. And then we deliver that water or pump it over the Tucson mountains and then down into the central Tucson, service area. So just think of it as a kind of large area with where the grounds are maintained and it's at a point where the water can percolate quickly and effectively down into the water table.
Great, thank you so much. Here's a question for Kirsten. In communities around Wilcox and Pierce, people's wells are failing because of all the agricultural use. Is there anything in the works to protect these individuals who can't drill deeper?
Well, that's precisely the issue that I was talking about in my presentation. That's the problem of the areas outside our active management area in which there is no state regulation of groundwater pumping. So now I think that this issue is really coming to the forefront. Of course, individual homeowners can drill their wells deeper, and in many situations that will resolve the problem for that individual homeowner. But of course, that's at great expense, and often the water lower down cannot be as good quality water. So that presents issues for them. So right now, we do not have any real state solution for that problem right now, and that needs to be front and center for policymakers.
Thank you, Kirsten. Here's a question that's directed to any of you that are willing to take it on, and it involves the Curvaquito Springs down near the border. The question is, do any of you have or know of data on how the building of the border wall affected the water situation along the border? I understand that the water in the Curvaquito Springs was significantly depleted. Does anyone have any updates on that?
I
Kathy?
know that Defenders of Wildlife have been probably the most active group paying attention to that, so I'd recommend checking in with them.
Okay. A question for Andrew or Kirsten from Facebook. Development is often done by the scraping of the land and water, and water is used to replant and nurture new plantings. Can more sustainable permaculture designs be encouraged? Andrew, you want to take that one?
Sure. And the short answer is yes. Again, a lot of the innovative things we're doing, both in an operational and at a policy level here at the city of Tucson, involves looking exactly at, how can we put that rainwater and stormwater to better use, including recharging the aquifer. So looking at more permeable surfaces, less concrete, and more surfaces that we can incentivize, or even in our development and building codes require or encourage. We believe that over, again, a large area like the city of Tucson and our service area, as much as we can do and encourage in that area, we think will have a real beneficial effect in helping us not just move water away from property, which is what the permeable surfaces do, and move to the non-permeable, and then move to the permeable, where again we can do more to get that water to plants and vegetation, as well as perhaps even down to assist the aquifer.
Thank you.
And I don't really have much to add in terms of the specifics on that, but to say that, I believe that really the state role should be to help and encourage the cities that are working on this, as well as researchers and nonprofits that are working on this to help provide, funding for and research for making sure that these types of programs can go forward.
Okay, great. Thank you. Here's a question for Kathy or Andrew, and let's let Kathy give a try at it. Whenever we drive by a capped canal aqueduct, we always worry about evaporation. Will you talk about any discussed solution to evaporation, especially as we get warmer, including putting solar panels on top of the canals?
Yeah, that's actually been a topic for quite some time. The reality is that because the water moves swiftly, there is not a lot of water lost in the canal itself. And honestly, when we first started the recharge program, we were really worried about evaporative loss from the recharge basins. And again, because they actually work so efficiently, the losses are quite limited. That's not to say that we couldn't reduce losses by putting solar panels on over the canal. That has been discussed. There's probably ways of doing it that have fewer transaction costs, I have to say, but it's a good idea.
Okay, great. Thank you. A question for Andrew. How is it environmentally sound to store water for Phoenix in Tucson? Isn't there an environmental price for moving water from Phoenix to Tucson and then back to Phoenix?
I'm really happy I got that question, because the partnership that Tucson has with Phoenix, when otherwise we're kind of rival cities in many ways, it is a model of innovation and has been recognized from the White House on down. We're very proud of it. And just to kind of give the 30,000 foot level of how it works, remember that we have the CAP canal, right? So we have this 336 mile canal that brings water from Western Arizona, from the Colorado River, through Phoenix and down to Tucson. So that's already there. The way the partnership works is Phoenix has its allocation of that river water, but in many cases doesn't have the storage facilities to store it, to save it for when they need it. Tucson, we do. So the way it works is Phoenix orders their water from off the river every year, just the same way we do. But what they do is they say, instead of delivering it to Phoenix, send it on down the canal to Tucson. Tucson takes that water for Phoenix, and we put it in the ground and save it for them. Ultimately, if there's a shortage and Phoenix wants to get their water back, we will order some of our water in Tucson and have it delivered through that same canal to Phoenix. So that's where Phoenix can benefit from some of the investments we've made here in Tucson in storage. And there's no additional canals or even to some degree power that's needed to get the water, back 100 miles uphill to Phoenix. I hope that makes sense.
Just to clarify, to make sure it does make sense, the water does not get pumped out of Tucson and back up to Phoenix. What happens is Phoenix takes its water directly from the Central Arizona Project Canal from the river, rather than it's not going back up. I mean, it's actually down, but it's not going back from us to Phoenix.
Yeah, I think the thing to remember here is that there's a lot of accounting that's going on at all levels of the state government, whether it's the 100-year water assured water supply or whether it's who gets their allocations and who's storing what. Somebody has got a really big spreadsheet somewhere. So that's an important component of it. There was a question directed to Andrew, but others could chime in as well, asking whether or not the Rosemont mine, the proposed Rosemont mine, might threaten our water quality. Now, I assume that's for the Tucson area in terms of water quality, but you could also answer it in terms of water supplies. Who wants to tackle that? Andrew, you want to take that one?
Well, I'll get it started. First, I just want to be clear that the city of Tucson and Tucson Water Service Area does not include the Rosemont mine area. So we're not necessarily directly involved with that. I would say that in the past, the city of Tucson mayor and council have raised a lot of questions and issues about the mine on a number of levels, including its potential effect on water supplies and water quality. So that is to the south of the city of Tucson and our service area. So hard for me to weigh in directly on what that might mean, but maybe Kathy or Kirsten can do so.
Would either of you like to take it on?
Well, one of the issues with respect to the mine that does intersect with the issues I was talking about on with respect to our watersheds is those ephemeral washes. So there's a lot of these areas that, of course, water flows in these washes during rain events, and yet I believe some of the places that Rosemont is planning to put some of its mining tailings will be in those washes. And so there's a concern there about whether or not that could impact water quality. And if that is not subject to state regulation, and it's also not subject currently to federal regulation under the Clean Water Act, that could really be a problem.
I think it's important to note also that the mine tailings are going to be on the east side of the Santa Ritas, which means it's actually not in the Tucson Basin per se, although there is a connection between that basin and the Cienega Wash, which does flow into the Tucson area. There is the potential for some water quality implications, but I think there are many dramatic implications for all of Southern Arizona. It's not limited to the Tucson Basin, but it's also not focused on the Tucson Basin.
Thank you all for your comments on that. And they lead into a question that I was going to ask Kirsten next, and it has to do with these ephemeral washes. And the question is, the Sonoran Desert waters are basically ephemeral waters, essential for recharging aquifers and maintaining the Sonoran Desert ecosystem and its wildlife. And they want to know, what is the protection that those are offered, and what's the potential for increasing the protection in Arizona?
Well, that's really, the issue of the moment with respect to Arizona's surface waters. So last year, the Trump administration came out with a rule that narrowed the jurisdiction of the federal government over waters under the Federal Clean Water Act. And the Federal Clean Water Act otherwise regulates discharges from polluting sources, industry and others, construction activities, as well as the discharge of dredge and fill into what is known as waters of the United States. And that has been exactly what is the full scope of that has been an issue of litigation, as well as rulemakings by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, working along with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. But the Trump administration did narrow the scope of federal jurisdiction that may be subject to change by the Biden administration today. But we're in this time where that is actually the legal scope under federal law. And the question for the state is whether or not they will come up under state law to expand the scope of regulatory jurisdiction in the state. So the state could, if it wanted to, protect all ephemeral waters. Right now, we're actually looking at a proposed legislation that would cover Arizona's major surface 8 major riparian areas, as well as the ephemeral reaches of those river systems, but otherwise not include other ephemeral washes. It's been somewhat controversial, to say the least, but the issue has not yet been resolved.
Thank you, Kirsten, for your comments there. We're running low on time. I have one question. I'm going to combine 2 questions for Andrew. One question is, how could the water rates be better structured to reward customers who work to limit their water use? And then the second question is about whether or not businesses like green grass golf courses are required to use reclaimed water, and are there penalties to homeowners in Arizona that have turf lawns? So
Sure.
pricing.
So to the first question about pricing, the city of Tucson for a number of years has been doing exactly what the question suggests, which is we have a tiered pricing structure, which means that if you're a low water user, meaning your household uses kind of the average to less than the average that a typical household uses, your price per unit, right, per gallon, so to speak, is at a certain rate. But that same price, if you use more, it goes up exponentially, actually. So we already do that. And we believe that some of the decline in water demand over the last 20 years, again, where the slope of the line goes down, as I showed in my earlier graph, we believe that a lot of that is due to putting some pricing measures in place that have made it expensive, even more expensive, to be a large water user. We always look at those pricings, and again, the mayor and council set the rates for Tucson Water. I don't believe there's any imminent change in those policies. So again, we continue to utilize those policies to try to drive down water use. And then the second question, I'm sorry, remind me again, what was?
It was about whether or not golf courses were required to use reclaimed water, and if there was a penalty for people who have lawns.
The city cannot require it, but what we do is for any city golf courses, we have them all now on reclaimed water. We have contracts with many local golf courses to connect to and use the reclaimed water system. So we think we've been successful. There are still some that rely on groundwater. There's nothing in law that gives us the authority to require them to use it. And then I'd also say we have agreements with, say, the Tucson Unified School District, some of the other school districts in our region, for them to use reclaimed water, again, for their ball fields, for their campuses, and again, writ large, that has had a positive effect in reducing the amount of potable water that goes for irrigation use in our region.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, we're pretty much out of time. I guess I'd just like to sort of end this by asking each of you very briefly to reflect on the question, what is it that gives you hope about our water future? And leave us on a positive note if we can do that. So Kirsten, would you like to start?
Sure, I am hopeful. I do see the concerns by Arizona citizens on this issue. You know, when I talk to my constituents, when I knock on doors, it's one of it is, I would say, the first issue people talk about with respect to the environment is they are concerned about water. And there's also so many people that really value Arizona's beautiful environment. And they know that, you know, wildlife and, you know, the desert ecosystems that are so unique and that bring people from all over the world, that it relies on having water and using it responsibly. So I would say that, you know, that is what makes me hopeful. I'm not always hopeful that we're taking this responsibility seriously enough in some of our institutions. We should be working a little bit harder and perhaps more aggressively to safeguard our water. But I am very much encouraged by the concern and the willingness to work on these issues.
Thank you. How about you, Andrew?
What makes me hopeful is looking to the past, especially the recent past, like I talked about over the last 20 years. And again, seeing how much we've been able to do to make our water supplies more resilient. I'm very proud of that work, appreciative of community leadership, and that's not just mayors and council members, past and present, but community leaders across Tucson who get what we're trying to do, understand the risks of not acting, and have shown that we can make a real difference through our activities every day and policy over years to make sure we have enough water to meet our community goals now and into the future. And then looking ahead, I'm very optimistic and even just personally happy about the role that again, local leaders, including our local delegation, plays in not just the shaping of water policy here in Tucson, but across the state. You know, having Senator Engel here, I think, is great. And I've worked with her over a number of years now, but both Senator Engel and many of her colleagues at the state legislature from Southern Arizona have taken the time to learn about water issues, to really get into the nitty-gritty about how this stuff works. And working together, you know, we're able to share information and ideas and have a strong influence over state water policy. I think we saw that with the drought contingency plan. I think we're seeing that as we develop other statewide solutions to water. And I'm just personally thankful to Senator Engel and her colleagues and other, again, community leaders from Southern Arizona who are playing a larger role in state water policy.
Great. And you, Kathy?
Well, I agree with both Andrew and Kirsten. I guess my optimism comes from the fact that we have achieved so much, and also the fact that the main ingredient that I think is missing at the state level has been leadership from the top on resolving these issues. And I think that it wouldn't take a huge sea change to get to a place where we really have a lot of opportunity to make a lot of the changes that need to be made. I also think all of the techniques and technologies and science that we need is available. It's just a question of political will in many cases. Sometimes it costs money, but often it saves money. So I do think the solutions are there. It's really, we need very brave leadership because it's never easy. And so it's really great that Kirsten is where she is. But the rest of us also need to be pulling hard. Thank you.
And thank you to all of you, our wonderful speakers for today. We really, really appreciate your thoughtful responses, your presentations, and your answers to our audience questions. We didn't get to all the questions, but the questions we had were very thoughtful, and we really are grateful. I want to make an announcement about our upcoming voter education program for April. The League of Women Voters is going to be producing a program on April 17th, 2020, entitled African American History in Tucson. And so pay attention if you choose to the League of Women Voters webpage, where that will be further announced. We've prepared a list of documents and websites for further reading, and we'll figure out a way to get it to you. We haven't solved that technological problem yet, but we really appreciate your being here today, and we hope your program has empowered you to use this knowledge to join the public debate about our water future. So thanks for attending and have a great weekend.